When I released part 1 of my Cyberpunk 2077 review, I issued a disclaimer, a warning, stating that CD Projekt Red would not allow me to use my own gameplay footage of the game to review the title on December 7th. I had to wait until December 9th, the day of the game's release in certain regions, before I could actually show you a lot of the technical issues that I encountered, alongside footage showing a lot of the stuff that I loved about the game. And I expressed how I felt that was very dishonest, like they were trying to hide something, and so I took a lot of umbrage with that decision. And then on top of that, CD Projekt did not issue any review codes for consoles, which I found to be suspect, almost as if they were trying to hide something. And it would turn out, now that the game has launched and a lot of people are playing the game and testing it out, even after the Day 0, Day 1 patch, turns out, yeah, it's very clear why they handled reviews the way they did, and I find the lack of transparency there to be unacceptable and disappointing coming from CD Projekt Red. Now, that's not to say Cyberpunk doesn't have a lot of positivity surrounding it. If you go to Metacritic right now, the PC version of the game, which is the best way to play the game right now, is sitting at a Metascore of 90, and then it turns out Cyberpunk 2077 has become the biggest PC launch in history, even going beyond World of Warcraft Shadowlands, which held the record for a few days. Cyberpunk surpassed even that, which is incredible and shows the level of hype. Going to Steam, you can see that with mostly positive reviews, you've got over 70,000 people who have reviewed the game, which really highlights how many people bought it. Though you can see that the rating isn't maybe as high as you'd expect, because a lot of people are pointing out that, they're loving the substance of the game, but the technical issues really do get in the way of their experience. Going to GOG, the game's got 3.8 out of 5 stars, which is still mostly positive, but again, maybe not as high as you'd expect, because a lot of the customer reviews are pointing out the flaws, the technical issues, the bugs that have permeated the title, but hundreds of pages worth of reviews, which goes to show how many people bought the game. And then going to Steam charts here, SteamDB in this case, you can see that the all-time peak has already skyrocketed to over 1 million players, which is insane and vastly surpasses Witcher 3's all-time peak. And just to give you more specific context about how well this game sold, the title managed to garner 8 million in pre-orders alone, which is insane, and no doubt it's gonna zoom past the 10 million mark pretty quickly, and 20 million I imagine is coming pretty soon as well. So the game is selling gangbusters. The hype surrounding it was unprecedented, and the substance of the game generally people seem to be happy with. A lot of people generally seem to be having fun, but all of this is being marred by the technical issues that people have discovered within the game, and many of which reviewers experience and that have not been solved with the Day 1 patch that CD Projekt Red said would fix a lot of the bugs and issues. Some stuff's been fixed, but certainly not everything. The game is still in an unpolished state, and consoles in particular, the console versions really, I cannot describe them as anything more than a disaster, particularly the base PlayStation 4 and Xbox One versions. The game's practically unplayable in its current state on those consoles. Plenty of articles out there about this situation, including this article from news outlet Charlie Intel, whose headline reads, "Cyberpunk 2077 is a disaster on Xbox One and PlayStation 4. From the outset, you've got a screenshot showing characters, textures, and details failing to load, and so people have stumbled upon situations like this, where character models straight up look like PS1 polygonal models. And then scrolling down, you've got a number of tweets that have been highlighted showing footage of the game running on base PS4 or base Xbox One. Granted, a lot of the footage highlighted here is before the patch, but even after the patch came out, a lot of the issues still persist. They still haven't been resolved. The state of the game is still very rough and not recommendable at all. So here's one Twitter user, Legolas. I'm gonna max out this video and show you guys what this individual encountered. So this is obviously the E3 2018 gameplay trailer, and then he's gonna compare that to base PS4 gameplay soon. Let's actually skip forward here, and you can see the footage is very grainy and rough, but it doesn't take much to see the difference. And you can see right there the issue where character models and textures take a while to load. Here's another video from Michael Does Life highlighting how textures can take upwards of 20 seconds to load and how resolution can dip into the 720p's on base PlayStation 4, though this is version 1.0 rather than version 1.2 or 1.3, whatever it's up to right now. But still doesn't change the fact that looking at some of this footage is troubling, and you can see this individual sort of driving through the city and textures taking a bit to load, models and details that are essential to one's immersion. And then the same Twitter user later that day said, "Imagine defending this. Cyberpunk 2077 is a terrible game based PS4 footage." And indeed, the PS4 version continues to show signs of, yeah, look at that. I mean, the way it takes so long for textures and models to load properly for these character models. I mean, look at that. That's ridiculous. And here we have Twitter user Steven with an even more comprehensive but still short video that spotlights some of the technical issues people have been finding, including, yeah, you know, models that clip through each other, stuff that doesn't load, NPCs that clip through objects and cars behaving in weird ways, physics that are not particularly realistic, and details just, and yeah, clipping through elements of the world that you shouldn't be able to clip through. And finally, Twitter user at I Enjoy Nintendo posted some footage showing the crowd density of the base PS4 version, and you can see that it's nowhere near what was shown in marketing materials. On PC, you can actually modify the crowd density from low to high, and on high, it is definitely closer to what was shown in marketing material, but on base PS4, yeah, that setting is turned all the way down, and so the city looks pretty empty. And then you've got folks like Paul Tassi from Forbes who took direct gameplay screenshots showing the difference between the PC version and all of its effects turned on versus the Xbox Series X version, whose visuals are definitely downgraded. The lighting in particular is nowhere near as effective compared to what you can accomplish on the PC version. Now, CD Projekt Red has said before that there is a next-gen upgrade coming that is slated for sometime next year, and I imagine that's gonna add some of those effects. On PS5 and Series X, you're playing the last-gen version that runs better with the newer hardware. Now, beyond the footage that players have been sharing online, you've got professional analysts like Digital Foundry who've dug deeper into Cyberpunk 2077's performance on consoles, and their discovery is about the same. Cyberpunk 2077 is a mess on PS4 and Xbox One, and the memes have already begun. This article specifically highlights some of the discoveries that Digital Foundry has made. The PS4 version, the base PS4 version, looks very blurry, running between 720p and 900p resolution, and the frame rate for any driving around the big city areas is constantly at around 20 frames per second. Now, it does state right here that indoor battles run much more stably at 30 frames per second, but that can also dip to 25 frames per second on occasions. And beyond the fact that frame rates can dip, it's the instability, the hitching, the hiccups, so that makes gameplay elements like shooting and driving more difficult than it should be to do that precisely. Things are much better when you run the game on a next-gen hardware with backwards compatibility mode. So on PlayStation 5, the frame rate was mostly unlocked to 60 frames per second, and there were a few drops here and there, but for the most part, it ran much more smoothly, save for, you know, the glitches, including T-posing NPCs and some of the bugs that I've previously pointed out, the immersion breaking stuff, and the occasional crash. Now, interestingly, the PlayStation 5 version by default is running on performance mode, whereas on Series X you can choose between quality mode and performance mode. So quality mode would run the game at around 4K 30 FPS. That's the target, whereas performance mode targets 60 frames per second and likely adjusts resolution to that end. But the ultimate conclusion that Digital Foundry made was that it's clear this early stage there is a significant divide between the PC version of Cyberpunk 2077 and the console versions. And beyond an article, they've got a whole video that they published on YouTube to prove it, and you can see how blurry the PS4 version of the title looks. Right here, for example, beyond the blur, you can see that certain objects are very low fidelity in terms of graphics. Looks like early PS3 game at times. And then beyond that, they highlight the performance between the two, and they note that while initially the PS4 version seemed to run fine with this interior space in the intro mission running at, 30 FPS with a few dips here and there, that seemed manageable. But then once they got into the open world, they started getting frame rates into the low 20s. And so that's when the trouble kicks in, where driving and shooting starts to feel untenable. And then beyond that, if we fast forward to this segment, frame rates can dip into the 15s, which at this point, yeah, you can see for yourself. Just looking at it, it looks unplayable, so choppy and unstable and unmanageable with all the hiccups that prevent precision, which is what's required in these scenarios. And this is more open world gameplay showing, 20s in terms of frames. So yeah, this is not ideal at all. And look, nobody was expecting the base PS4 and base Xbox One version of Cyberpunk to work any miracles. Obviously, that hardware is so old that Cyberpunk was obviously going to have visual compromises and some performance compromises, but there's simply way too many compromises with this title, where visual fidelity shouldn't be anywhere near this low given what other developers have accomplished in cross-generation titles like this, where the last-gen version did still hold its own enough, and performance here dipping into the 15s, that's just ridiculous. No game should run at such low frames per second. Performance, I'd argue, is even more important than the visual fidelity, and if you can't get the performance to run at a stable 30 FPS, with maybe a couple drops, but not to the point where you're getting into the low 20s and the 15s and 10s, yeah, at that point, this is straight up unacceptable. Now, on PS4 Pro, it's better, but still not ideal. So, interior environments like this do run at a locked 30 frames per second, but then we fast forward to the open world, and once again, you see that dip into the 20s, 25, 26 frames per second, 24, and then fast forwarding to the same shootout sequence, you can see that the frame rates are higher. Instead of, 10s, 15s, you're getting 20s, but still, enough drops and enough instability where it is going to disrupt the experience, where it is going to feel choppy, where it isn't going to allow for that level of precision, and you can see high 10s. So the PS4 Pro version definitely runs better than base PS4, but it's still not in a place where it is a version that I would recommend. There's another YouTube channel, Rosero, who uploaded this comparison video showing both Series S and Series X, as well as PS4 and PS5 and PS4 Pro, and the numbers speak for themselves. So right here we have a comparison between Xbox One S, Xbox One X, and Xbox Series S. You can see that One S really deeply struggles. That version's probably the worst one, performing even worse than base PS4, given it has even weaker hardware. You can see that it's struggling to maintain 20 frames per second even. Now, the One X version is more stable, though still dipping here and there into the high 20s, so not a full-on 30 FPS, whereas the Series S seems to have much less trouble maintaining those frame rates. So right here you can see that it's a solid 30 frames per second. And finally, we have Xbox Series X. There is a comparison here between performance mode and quality mode. You can see that performance mode, for the most part, maintains 60 frames, occasionally dips into the high 50s. Quality mode maintains a rock solid 30 frames per second, and this has 4K resolution, or targets 4K resolution. So Series X performance is definitely very, very playable. And same thing goes with PS5, which only has a performance mode, and here's a comparison with PS4. You can see right here, PS4 dips quite a bit into the 20s. PS5, on the other hand, maintains a rock-solid 60 with the occasional dip into the high 50s. And yeah, right here you can see that for a moment there, it dipped into the 15, so very unstable on PlayStation 4, much more stable on PS5. So if you do have a next-gen console, playing the console version will be a much more ideal experience from a performance standpoint. Still, the bugs and all that persist even after the patch, according to everything I've seen. And so looking at the full picture, we get a much clearer idea for why CD Projekt Red delayed the game after it went gold, why they were so restrictive with their review embargoes that did not allow for reviewers' own gameplay footage to be shown on December 7th, it's abundantly clear now why they didn't send out review codes for the console versions of this game. They wanted to keep the technical issues hidden until the very last minute as to not affect sales and not garner all of this PR backlash shortly before the game's launch. And it is a really crappy move. That is incredibly dishonest marketing, and for those who only own the base PS4 and Xbox One, buying this game is buying something that is simply unfinished and broken enough where it's not playable. I would never play the game in that state where frame rates can dip into the 10s. And keep in mind that most owners of PS4s and Xbox Ones, they own the base versions. PS4 Pro sales are less than base PS4, and Xbox One X sales are much less than regular Xbox One sales. So the worst version of the game is what most people will be playing. Now, CD Projekt Red did release their own PS4 Pro gameplay, which looks something like this. And they also released their own Xbox One X and Series X footage, which looks like this. This is specifically the game running on One X. But even this doesn't feel representative of what we actually are seeing on the One X and the PS4 Pro. The bugs obviously weren't highlighted here, and performance seems less stable than what was presented here. And on top of that, there was no footage shown of the base Xbox One and PS4 versions whatsoever, and now we know exactly why. Because it wasn't ready, and they knew that if they were to show that footage, people would see that it is a version that they should not buy. Now that the game is out, now that I'm seeing that a lot of technical issues still persist after the Day 0, Day 1 patch, now that I'm seeing that performance issues are still there despite the removal of Denuvo, now that I'm seeing the state of the game on the PS4 and Xbox One versions, yeah, there's no doubt in my mind this game is simply not finished. It needs a few more months in the oven, and they should have delayed it. What CD Projekt Red maybe should have done was release the PC version of the game first, which is the more stable of all the versions and the more graphically representative of how this game is meant to look. But even that version is rough enough where I would say the PC version should have been delayed as well. They should have delayed the entire release of this game across the board and ironed everything out, really worked on polishing everything, because, again, for me, the substance is there. The writing, the dialogue, the gameplay is solid. For me, this game really is greater than the sum of its parts. I overall had a really good time with it, with so many memorable moments that stuck with me, but I'd be lying if I said that the technical issues didn't get in the way enough where the experience was disrupted. There are many even arguing that CD Projekt Red should have canceled the PS4 and Xbox One versions, the last-gen versions outright, and just stuck to the PC and next-gen versions and let this just be a next-gen game, because that's clearly what it is, and it's just a struggle to get this to run on last-gen hardware. But at the same time, it's worth keeping in mind that most gamers right now are on PS4 and Xbox One. That's such a huge audience base. PS4 alone sold over 100 million units. That's a big audience that they'd be missing out on if they just released the game on Series X and PS5 and PC. But the thing is, if they cannot execute, they shouldn't be selling the product for that platform, because the game clearly doesn't work on last-gen hardware, at least not in its current state. And we'll see what happens months down the line, because Witcher 3 launched in an incredibly buggy state, especially on consoles back when it came out, and they certainly have come a long way since, but I'm not going to treat CD Projekt Red differently. At launch, the game should meet certain standards and then expand from there, rather than start behind the starting line and work its way towards getting to the starting line, which is what we're seeing with pretty much all versions of this game, but it's especially bad, especially awful on base PS4 and base Xbox One. And the lengths to which CD Projekt Red went through to hide that by limiting the review process in very restrictive ways so that we couldn't cover the console versions and we couldn't show the bugs and technical issues on PC alone until the day the game came out or a day before the game came out in other regions. That is egregious. That is unacceptable to me, and that really sullies the goodwill that CD Projekt Red has built up to an extent. CD Projekt Red is supposed to be that consumer-friendly company that doesn't lie to its customers and that are always communicative and always transparent, but this whole process has been anything but. This is probably the most restrictive review embargo that I've experienced. I've never been told by a publisher to not use my own gameplay footage until the day of. And it's a damn shame to see CD Projekt Red pull something like this. Really kind of diminishes my trust. That's not to say that I don't sympathize with the circumstances surrounding 2020 and the disruption that the pandemic has had on all games development environments, but everyone's facing the same challenges, and at the end of the day, CD Projekt Red did release a product that wasn't ready for launch, that was underbaked, and that was deceitfully marketed through negligence, through a lack of transparency. Now, CD Projekt Red did release a statement addressing the issues people have been facing. Here's a tweet from December 10th, 2020 that reads, "We are truly humbled that so many of you trusted us and decided to support Cyberpunk 2077 before the release. Even 8 million thank yous isn't enough." They're referencing the 8 million pre-orders that the game garnered, which again is massive. "The journey has just begun and we are hard at work on the upcoming fixes and updates to the game. See you in Night City." And given the amount of progress I saw with Witcher 3, no doubt we'll see Cyberpunk 2077 make a lot of progress in the coming months. But people bought the game to play right here, right now. They bought a product and they're expecting it to meet a certain bar that Cyberpunk, from a technical standpoint, certainly does not meet in its current state, especially the console versions. And CD Projekt Red is not going to get any special treatment compared to other companies. If EA, Ubisoft, Take-Two, you name it, did something similar, I'd say exactly the same things. This is not right. And I've seen some people say, well, you should have known you're playing a 2020 game on 2013 hardware, but CD Projekt Red touted time and again that the game would run on current-gen consoles, and when you sell a product, when you sell a game on a specific console, the expectation is it will run. It will run well enough that it's playable. That's simply not the case for the base last-gen consoles especially, and even the, again, Pro and One X versions are still shaky in their performance enough where it's not the ideal way to play the game. This is the fault of CD Projekt Red's own messaging, the expectations that they set, and the fact that they sold the product on a platform that the game is not meant to run on, at least in its current state. And while I ultimately had a great time with Cyberpunk, I gotta call this stuff out, especially now that the game has launched and now that I've seen how the patches that they've released perform and how little difference it's made with certain key issues, and what a major problem the console versions that are being sold at full price are. It's a shame that we're getting a repeat of Witcher 3. While that game is still considered to be one of the best RPGs of all time, you know, the issues that it shipped with, you know, for the early adopters, it certainly wasn't a pleasant thing. I would have loved them to not make the same mistake again, but alas, it looks like, you know, the game, I'm sure, will be in a much better state months from now. But if you've been following my channel for a while now, you know that I'm not a big fan of the ship now, fix later model that so many other AAA titles, live services in particular, have employed. And it's a shame to see Cyberpunk 2077 walk this path. As much fun as I personally did have with Cyberpunk, and as much of an achievement the game still is in a lot of ways, a lot of just incredible technical and creative artistry that went into this, there are so many negative elements surrounding this that cast a dark shadow on a game that really does feel like developers pour their hearts and soul into it, that has so much substance that I could get lost in, but, you know, I cannot not call out this stuff. And it's especially disappointing when it comes from a company who you'd expect would be better than this. So yeah, that's my take on this whole situation, everything going on surrounding Cyberpunk 2077's technically troubled launch. that I hope will be rectified sooner rather than later. Let me know in the comments below what your experience with this game has been like and what your reaction is to all of this. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.